Good morning. It's Wednesday, July 30th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 663 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. The New York Times is starting to revise its narrative about Gaza. Some of that utterly unresponsible or irresponsible reporting is about starvation is now being walked back. I suppose this is good news, but just so we're clear, Israel continues to take a beating in the news. The narrative about starvation is as much about Israel's lack of a clear policy in Gaza as it is about journalists with an axe to grind. Israel needs a serious change in policy to help steer the country out of this crisis because perception is reality. New thinking is sorely needed. Today's guest is a repeat offender, Nadav Eyal, a columnist for Yediot Ahronot and Ynet, two popular news sites in Israel. He's also a fellow at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, or SIPA, and he's a regular commentator on Dan Senor's excellent Call Me Back podcast. We're going to cover lots of ground today, from the Gaza famine claims to what's happening in Syria. So stay tuned for that conversation coming your way right after I share some thoughts of my own. The British government announced yesterday that it would recognize a Palestinian state if Israel didn't set a new course in Gaza amidst allegations of possible famine. Prime Minister Keir Starmer also says he wants Israel to commit to a two-state solution. This comes in the wake of an announcement by President Emmanuel Macron of France that he's preparing to recognize the state of Palestine. Set aside the fact that these two countries appear to be rewarding Hamas. It's worse than that. We're heading back to the future. It was Britain and France in 1916 that inked the ignominious Sykes-Picot Agreement. That was the disastrous love child of these two colonial powers who thought they knew what was best for the Middle East. A century later, their harebrained map has created more problems than we can count. One conflict after another in this basket case of a region tracks back to the ill-advised borders concocted by the foreign policy bozos of Imperial Britain and France. Today, these two countries insist they're no longer colonial powers, and yet they're still trying to remake the map. In other words, the hubris of these two middling powers hasn't changed a bit. They still think they know better. I shudder to think about the impact of creating yet another failed state in the Middle East, and that's exactly where we're heading if France and Britain have their way. As the truism goes, those who ignore history are destined to repeat it. Here we go again. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Syrian refugees displaced during the country's civil war are starting to return home. Yesterday, 72 refugees returned to Syria from Lebanon under a new plan that the United Nations developed in partnership with the Lebanese government. Okay, first, a little context. The civil war in Syria displaced about half of the country's population. Many refugees settled in neighboring Lebanon. In fact, at one point, Syrian refugees made up about 25% of Lebanon's total population. That's caused serious strain on a country that's already in an economic tailspin. Thankfully, since Assad's ouster in December of last year, approximately 205,000 Syrians have crossed back into Syria from Lebanon. But the group of 72 that returned the other day were actually somewhat special. They were the guinea pigs for a repatriation program under which the UN is offering $100 to each returning refugee, which is not a lot of money, but in addition to things like legal assistance and other services. Apparently, some 17,000 Syrians in Lebanon have already signed up for this program. Seems like good news if you ask me, all things considered. Headline 2, the IDF has released an assessment of its fall 2024 campaign against Hezbollah. The operation was called Northern Arrows, and it was a resounding success. According to the IDF, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 Hezbollah operatives and commanders were eliminated. 9,000 other terrorists were plucked off the battlefield. Hezbollah's elite Radwan force was completely incapacitated. The group's small-scale launch sites, 70 to 80% of them are gone. The IDF also destroyed approximately 1,500 underground assets. As for the future, if Hezbollah decides to launch an attack, it's unlikely to overwhelm Israel's air defenses. I think that's good news. The future prospects of the group are pretty poor right now all around. with no real path ahead because of weak leadership and because of general confusion in their ranks. But then again, it's important to remember that Israel sustained nearly a year of attacks from Hezbollah before responding with that overwhelming force. And that all came at a huge cost. Tens of thousands of Israelis were forced from their homes. There's a lesson here. Imagine what would have happened had Israel decided to strike Hezbollah earlier. How many lives and homes and property could have been saved? Headline 3, the Houthis have again threatened to escalate attacks against international shipping. This is what I call an evergreen tweet on X. Here's what our favorite psychotic Yemeni goat herders have to say. All ships belonging to companies that do business with Israel are now targets. It doesn't matter where the company's based or where its ships are heading. This is a break from previous policies. The Houthis had previously said that they only targeted Israeli-owned ships or ships docking at Israeli ports. Of course, that was a complete farce because the Houthis were regularly attacking ships owned and operated or flagged by other countries. This is the fourth phase of that purported naval blockade against Israel, so say the Houthis. All of this is a violation of the group ceasefire with the United States that was inked back in May. And I still believe that this is a problem not just for Israel to tackle. A major maritime route that is crucial to the global economy remains under active threat. Where is the international community right now? Just crickets. All right. With that, it's time for my conversation with award-winning Israeli columnist Nadav Eyal. Let's dive right in. Welcome to the program, Nadav Eyal.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Great to have you. All right. Talk to me about Gaza. I mean, bottom line, is there a famine? What are you hearing from people on the ground? What is the ground truth, as they call it, in the Gaza Strip?
From what I'm hearing, both from sources in Gaza right now, from Israeli sources, and from aid groups, is that Gaza is in the midst of a severe humanitarian crisis. There is hunger in Gaza. You know, there are different notions that would be used: starvation, famine, hunger. The truth of the matter is that there is a vast food insecurity. There's malnutrition, there's lack of access to enough food, including, for instance, to baby formula. It's not generally in Gaza. It's usually enclaves within Gaza in which you see these problems. Every region is different. It's not a coherent condition. Hospitals are still functioning. And they can supply and do supply food, but it's definitely a crisis. And, you know, even the Israeli government in that regard is not denying this. And the proof is in the pudding that they're allowing, much more of leniency towards, aid groups. Basically, my sources within the defense establishment in Israel are saying if 2 weeks ago, we were pressured not to allow aid in if we would risk this falling to the hands of Hamas. Now we're getting phone calls from the government saying, just get as much aid in as possible into Gaza. And that's a change of policy. You see humanitarian pauses, you see humanitarian corridors, etc.
And I think, by the way, that's the right thing to do. I mean, Israel should be doing this. The goal was never to deprive the population of food. The goal was always to put pressure on Hamas. And, of course, we know that Hamas was using the aid, distributing the aid. It was a way of maintaining agency and actually also making some money. So, okay, right now we have a crisis. It needs to be dealt with. And I'm glad to hear that the Israeli government is taking action. I think the actions over the last couple of days make a lot of sense, and I wouldn't argue with it. I know it probably is a setback to the Israeli strategy of depriving Hamas. But so now let's talk about that strategy for a minute. Netanyahu is not giving up on his goal of destroying Hamas. So what's his best way out here? I mean, I hear him talking about annexing Gaza or doubling down on this military strategy. None of this seems to really jive with reality, at least from my perspective. It seems like a complete shift in strategy is necessary. I've been talking about it and writing about it, but I'm curious to get your thoughts, Nadav. Netanyahu's best way forward? I know you're not an advisor to Netanyahu, but if you were to assess kind of what his options are, what are the good ones?
So first of all, the best one, and it's not my opinion, it's what the prime minister, as far as I know, as far as my sources are telling me, both at the defense establishment and the political level, his best option is to get a deal. What Netanyahu really wants, Jonathan, here is to get a hostage deal, a two-phase hostage deal, the Witko framework, 10 hostages back home, a ceasefire of 60 days. The IDF, he wants to withdraw, of course, as little as possible in the Gaza Strip, but he's willing to have basically a very widespread withdrawal of the IDF forces in the Gaza Strip to the perimeter around the border of the Gaza Strip and the Philadelphia corridor. And this is what Netanyahu wants. Now, in order to do so, he needs to pressure Hamas, because Hamas is very encouraged by the international response to what's happening in the humanitarian sense in Gaza. Hamas is, according just to its actions and to what the Egyptians are saying, the Qataris are saying, and of course the US is saying right now, they don't feel pressured at all. So, if Israel is stressed because of the international condemnations and the isolation of Israel as a result of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, you would have expected Hamas, as the rulers of Gaza, to be very pressured to reach an agreement as soon as possible in order to ease the pain of the population. But you would expect that only if you know nothing about Hamas. Hamas is profiting from it, both in terms of money, but also internationally speaking. For them, hearing the threats against Israel, that France and the UK are going to recognize a Palestinian state, this is exactly what they were pitching when they decided on October 7th.
So no, absolutely. I think you can see that this strategy is, I mean, they're obviously, they're feeling quite pleased. I mean, the way that I've tried to I think, frame this is, Sinwar made a huge mistake and he ended up destroying a huge infrastructure of Iranian support and the axis of resistance and the ring of fire. From a kinetic perspective, that all collapsed. But the isolation that he envisioned for Israel as it fought back against Hamas, I mean, this guy is smiling from the grave right now, I think, as we see what's happening to Israel internationally. But so let's talk about that international isolation that Israel's feeling right now. I mean, France, UK, I just saw something about Malta yesterday. You have a whole host of non-aligned countries that have already declared for like a decade now that they're ready to recognize the state of Palestine, as they call it. So what's sort of the impact here on Israel? And is there a response? I mean, everything that I'm seeing out of Bibi right now is he's pointing the finger back at Starmer and others saying, look, you're rewarding terrorism. And then Starmer said today, no, I'm not. And it's sort of it's like an argument between two 5-year-olds right now, as far as I see it. I mean, this doesn't feel like a particularly sophisticated disagreement that's taking place on the world stage. But I get the sense that Israel's losing as a result. Where do you shake out in all of this?
Well, I tend to agree. Look, this first of all, recognizing Palestinian state, or the way that Starmer himself presented it, the Prime Minister of the UK. If we don't reach a ceasefire until September, then the UK will recognize Palestinian state. That's actually incentivizing Hamas not to reach a ceasefire. Okay, in their own thinking until September, then they get the recognition for Palestinian state. They get another win. But generally speaking, Israel is more isolated today than ever. Speaking with officials within the government, they recognize this is the worst crisis probably in Israel's history, including after 1973, after 1967, in terms of the way that it's approached diplomatically. And it's not only on a political leadership level. Israeli press is just full of stories of Israelis abroad and the way that they're being attacked, thrown out of restaurants, attacked in the streets for speaking Hebrew. Not having a flag or a demonstration about returning the hostages or anything like that. And to say that the government is really now, meeting for special emergency meetings and trying to develop a strategy to fight this that would be too much. The government was trying to stop sanctions from the EU rather successfully in the last month or so, explaining to them what's happening. But now speaking about annexation of the Gaza Strip is definitely not going to do the trick on two different levels. First of all, it's going to give Hamas another playing field in the Arab world, the Palestinian street. Hey, the Israelis are now speaking about actually grabbing parts of Gaza again and having maybe villages or settlements there or something like that. So it just gives them a raison d'etat. And then on the international level, it really goes against everything that these countries are talking about. As to the US, I'm not sure that the president is going to wade in if Israel says, as punitive measures, if we don't get a deal, we're going to grab some part of Gaza and annex it. Also, what does it mean if no country will actually recognize that annexation? What does it actually mean? Because Netanyahu doesn't want to have settlements there to begin with. So right now, I think it will be highly exaggerated to say that Israel has a strategy to deal with that isolation. And it's even an exaggeration to say that they're really thinking about this thoroughly. Yeah. They're trying, first and foremost, to get as much aid to the Gaza Strip in order to try to first extinguish the fire, the flames, and then think about this later. But this is kind of this is not really tactically or strategically thinking about Israel's condition in the world right now.
No, I think we all still, I think, see this confusion, and I think the pressure's on for the Netanyahu government to respond in a way that will address this sort of holistically. But you mentioned Trump for a minute, and I've got to ask you. I mean, he did voice the other day some concerns about Gaza. I mean, the messaging from the president here it's been a mixed bag. I mean, he sort of said on the one hand that Hamas spurned these negotiations, that Hamas, has essentially invited the Israelis to rethink a military response. He said the Israelis have some important choices ahead of them. Some are saying, though, that when he started to talk about starvation, when he started to talk about aid, that it was a sign of frayed ties between Bibi and Trump. I'm not sure I see that, but I'm curious. Do you see signs of that in any way? Are we looking at renewed tensions between Netanyahu and Trump after this triumphant bilateral operation against the Islamic Republic?
I don't see that tension yet. Okay, first of all, we know that Ron Dermer and Tzachi Hanegbi were just in DC to discuss Gaza and align both on Gaza and Iran. And we also know that Steve Witkoff is, I think it's a Barak Ravid story, just broke during our show right now. He's going to fly over to Israel, mainly to discuss the humanitarian situation. And here's the reason why. I think the president understands that Netanyahu really wants a ceasefire and a hostage deal right now. And I'm saying this purely on a political level, without addressing the hostages as a real crisis in the Israeli society. Just politically speaking, getting a deal right now is the best thing that Netanyahu could do in terms of his own interest. And if he managed to convince the president that this is the case and that he's not fooling around, then there's not going to be a big crisis between Israel and the White House. But we see that Republicans and the White House are distancing themselves from the crisis in Gaza because the president was extremely clear that he wants the war to end, that it needs to be wrapped up, that he wants assistance and aid and food to go into the Gaza Strip. These are things that President Trump has said himself. It's not my interpretation. And this has not developed the way that he charted. And I think that there's a good case to be made there in the White House if they do want to blame Netanyahu. Right now, the impression there is that Netanyahu wants a deal, and that's my impression too, but it might be too late. If you overdo this, Jonathan, there's a phase in which you need to do this as quickly as possible. Just get the deal, because many things can happen during war. One of them is a humanitarian crisis.
Getting a deal quickly, though, that's where mistakes are made, right? I mean, I understand the pressure, but you enter into a deal quickly and maybe don't lock down all of the specifics. You can potentially find yourself in a worse position. I mean, I got to say, it just feels in general like Bibi's back is up against a wall right now. And that's not a good position for him to be in. It's not a good position for Israel to be in. And yeah, I mean, we're going to continue to track this, but I absolutely appreciate your analysis here. I've got just a question or two left for you before I let you go. I mean, real quick on Syria. It feels like the Druze crisis has subsided, and if that's the case, does it mean that Israel and the new Syrian regime are back on track for normalization, or do you think we're just sort of right now in kind of a pregnant pause, if you will, because at one point things like they really looked like they were on track and moving quickly, and Trump was clearing the way for this. When Israel starts striking the Syrian military, that's not a great sign for normalization. I think we could be, clear about that. So where do you think we are right now with the Syrian situation?
I think that right now it's definitely a pregnant moment in the sense that everybody's waiting for the ceasefire in Gaza. Look, what Israel broke in Syria in that attack in Damascus is not something that you mend that easily. Why? It's not about the relations with Ashara or Julani. He wants an agreement with Israel. He understands the benefits of that. The problem is that something popular exploded there about Israel and its involvement in Syria. Now, this regime is not a democracy, but when you see demonstrations after demonstrations, you see that there's something happening there, brewing there, and his grip is not as powerful and consolidated. So the Israelis are doing things to minimize the damages, and they feel that they needed to do that to defend the Druze community. But they also understand that they might have overplayed this. And of course, the Trump administration was very adamant that they didn't like Israel's response.
Well, unnamed officials, have come out. We haven't seen, to my knowledge anyway, Donald Trump or J.D. Vance coming out and saying that. But I think the bottom line is that you're correct here, that there's been an outcry from within Syria. I think there are questions actually even within Israel about the wisdom of this. But I think Israel's at least made a point here that the war crimes that were normalized in the past by jihadis across the Middle East not going to be tolerated any longer. And I do think that is an important message that's been delivered by the Israelis.
Oh, absolutely, Jonathan. And more than that, I think that the international media and politicians in the West have completely brushed off what we have learned after the Israeli attack. The kind of footage that we have seen, the videos we have seen of ethnic cleansing, real ethnic cleansing of people who are being asked, are you Druze, then shot, of mass executions and crimes against humanity. And nobody's discussing this, right? And it was brushed off, but it's still, the wisdom of Israel's involvement towards
it's still being debated, and I think it's still being discussed. By the way, for folks listening at home or on your way to the office today, Cliff May's got a terrific new piece about the Druze to help folks. I think it's like a Druze 101 or maybe even a graduate level course, but I absolutely recommend it. Nadav, last question before I let you go. What's the latest on the nuclear program in Iran? I read this morning that the regime is starting to do some cleanup on those sites that were struck. All of this seems to kind of have, escaped the headlines. How concerned is Israel right now with the folks that you talked to that its victory last month was fleeting and that Iran is trying to make a comeback of sorts, whether on the nuclear file, air defenses, ballistic missiles? I mean, I'm hearing that they are thinking about how to rebuild or to build back better, so to speak.
Yeah, so the Israeli assessment is that the damages to the nuclear program are substantial and lasting, and that it is no longer, in terms of the defense establishment of Iran, as a priority as it was before in rebuilding. My sources are telling me that for the Iranians, their prime priority is their air defenses right now, trying to rebuild the air defenses. And after that, the surface-to-surface ballistic missiles. And only after that, the third place is their nuclear program, because it is so devastated. So we will see cleanup attempts, salvage attempts. We'll see all of that, right? But my Israeli sources are saying we're most worried about the surface ballistic missile program. And we're seeing some actions there. And that worries us most, talking about a possible second round of this war. And of course, an attempt by the Iranians to somehow surprise Israel in order to get their status in the region to some extent deterrent back. And this is something the IDF is very much talking about. We need to make sure we're not going to be surprised by the Iranians in the next few years.
Yeah, I'm hearing basically the same. They're not so concerned about the air defense reconstruction because the Israelis have the tech to be able to destroy those air defenses again if need be. The nuclear program, I'm hearing same thing, basically set back 2.5, 3 years minimum, and that it's not going to be easy for Iran to build back. But those surface-to-surface missiles, the ones that did grave damage to Israel, if they're able to rebuild those and regain some of those capabilities, that's a major problem, because, of course, if Israel starts striking Iranian assets, then those ballistic missiles start flying again. And that's the deterrent factor for Israel, that they're just simply not up for another round right now. And so there's this sort of eerie calm that has descended upon these two fronts. Okay, I'm going to let you go, Nadav. Thank you so much for your comments today, for your analysis. So again, thank you, Nadav Eyal, for joining us today on the FDD.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, we went a little long today, but I think it was well worth it. Here's what FDD has on tap for you today. First, FDD's Ryan Brobst and Fanny Chow break down Taiwan's annual Han Kuang military exercise in their article for Defense News. Han Kuang 41 was Taiwan's largest and most complex drill in years, highlighting major progress in preparing for a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, while revealing some critical gaps too. FDD experts continue to engage with Taipei, by the way, to explore how this beleaguered democracy can strengthen its defense capabilities. With any luck, this collaboration will lead to some solid security insights and recommendations. Check out my colleague Hussein Abdul Hussein's New York Post piece on Israel's intervention to halt the al-Shara regime's brutal assault on the Druze community in Sueda. Hussein highlights how the global focus quickly moved from the massacre itself to accusations that Israel violated Syrian sovereignty. The media coverage has been pretty rough for Israel these days all around. I think we can all agree on that. Finally, FDD's Enya Kravin writes for the Allgemeiner on Secretary of State Rubio's sanctions, targeting UN Special Rapporteur and unabashed Israel hater Francesca Albanese. The entire episode shines a harsh light on the rising tide of lawfare, where bodies like the ICC single out democratic allies, alleging violations of human rights. Washington's message is clear: weaponizing international law to assault America or its partners will carry steep consequences. Indeed, they already have. And that's all she wrote for today, folks. If you're craving more brainy things to read, check out the expert analysis on our website. Read our quick takes on X or watch the videos we post on Instagram and YouTube. You can also make that tax-deductible donation anytime at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another gripping episode of the FDD Morning Brief. It'll be a can't-miss one featuring Michael Oren, former Israeli ambassador and Knesset member, to a former ambassador to the U.S., that is, and Knesset member in Israel. So it'll be a good one. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, as always, signing off for FDD.